Millions of people swear that weed locks them into deep, unbreakable focus. Students use it to study, programmers use it to code. Artists say it's the only way they can disappear into their work for hours. And then you put those exact same people in a lab, hand them a focus test, and measure what actually happens. They get slower, they make more mistakes, they lose the thread of what they were doing. So one of two things is true. Either millions of people are wrong about their own brains, or the science is missing something. And the answer is stranger than either, because weed doesn't actually increase your focus. It increases your feeling of being focused. And it does that by quietly switching off the one part of your brain that would have told you the difference. Let me show you how that works. To understand this, you have to understand what THC is actually doing up there. THC is the part of cannabis that gets you high. And one of the first things it does is nudge your brain's dopamine and reward system. Now, here's the thing most people get wrong about dopamine. Dopamine isn't really the pleasure chemical. It's more like this matters, pay attention to this chemical. It's the highlighter your brain uses to mark what's important. So when THC bumps that system, ordinary things suddenly feel significant. The song feels deeper. The idea feels profound. The task in front of you feels weirdly fascinating. And that sensation, everything narrowing down to one glowing, fascinating thing, feels exactly like focus, but it isn't. Real focus is your brain choosing what to ignore. What weed gives you is a brain where everything feels important, which is almost the opposite. It's less like a spotlight you're aiming and more like a spotlight that keeps wandering to whatever's shiniest, which is why you can spend 40 minutes deeply focused on completely the wrong thing. This gap between how focused people feel and how they actually perform is one of the most consistent findings in the research. And it is huge. People report feeling deeply locked in, while objective tests show slower reaction times, more errors, and worse follow through on anything complex. It shows up everywhere. In one line of research, people high on cannabis rated their own ideas as more creative. But when judges scored those same ideas, the actual creativity hadn't improved at all. They didn't get more creative. They just got more convinced that they were. And then there's the big one. In January 2025, researchers at the University of Colorado ran the largest brain imaging study of its kind, over 1,000 adults. They scanned people's brains while they did working memory tasks, the exact mental muscle you use to hold instructions in your head or solve a problem step by step. In heavy lifetime users, 63% showed reduced activity in the brain regions that handle decision making, memory, and attention. Of all the mental skills they tested, working memory took the biggest hit. Working memory is basically the RAM of your brain. And it's the first thing to buckle. Okay, but if the science is this clear, we have a problem, because it still doesn't explain the diehards. The people who genuinely seem to work better, especially a certain kind of person. And this is where it gets interesting. There's an idea in neuroscience called the inverted U. Picture a curve shaped like a hill. On the left, too little dopamine in your prefrontal cortex, and you feel scattered, restless, can't settle. On the far right, too much, and you're also scattered, wired, jumpy, unable to hold a thought. The sweet spot is right at the top of the hill. That top of the hill is what real focus feels like from the inside. And here's the uncomfortable part. If your brain naturally sits too far to the left of that hill, understimulated, always chasing something, then a nudge could, in theory, push you closer to the top. Which brings us to the group that comes up in almost every one of these conversations. People with ADHD. An ADHD brain often does run low on that dopamine sweet spot. And a lot of people with ADHD say cannabis helps them settle and concentrate. So is this the exception? The one case where weed really does help focus? This is exactly the question doctors have been trying to pin down. And in December 2024, the Canadian ADHD Resource Alliance put out a formal position statement on it. Their conclusion was blunt. There is no good evidence that cannabis is an effective treatment for ADHD and no evidence that it improves attention. The feeling that it helps is real and it's common, but when researchers actually measure attention, the improvement doesn't show up. And the quality of evidence from people just reporting that it helps them is rated as extremely low. Part of the reason is that the inverted U is really precise. Even if a tiny dose could nudge someone toward the top of the hill, the dose in a normal joint is nowhere near that fine. Today's cannabis often runs 15 to 20% THC, and some strains push past 30. That doesn't gently nudge the marble to the top. It launches it clean off the other side. Now, remember the switch I mentioned at the start. Here's the mechanism that ties this whole thing together. The part of your brain that monitors your own performance, that quietly checks, am I doing this well? Am I making mistakes? Is called metacognition. It's you watching yourself think. And that self-monitoring system is one of the first things cannabis dials down. So you don't just perform a little worse. You also lose the internal alarm that would normally tell you you're performing worse. The error light isn't off because there are no errors. The error light is off because someone unplugged it. You can see this in the driving research, which is a little terrifying. Heavy users often rate themselves as barely impaired behind the wheel, while the simulator says they're impaired just as much as everyone else. They're not lying. They genuinely can't feel it. And that is the whole trap in one sentence. There's one more layer, and it's the sneakiest for heavy daily users. Something else is going on. When they're not high, they feel foggy, restless, and unfocused. That's early withdrawal. So they smoke and the fog lifts and they feel sharp again, but they're not climbing above normal. They're just climbing back to normal. The focus boost is really just relief from the deficit the weed itself created. It feels like a superpower. It's actually just paying off a debt. So let's go back to the very first question. Does weed increase focus? Here's the honest answer, and it's more interesting than a simple yes or no. Real focus is two things at once. It's doing difficult mental work, and it's being able to tell that you're doing it well. Weed can absolutely give you the feeling of the first one, that warm, narrow, everything is fascinating tunnel, but it does it by quietly disconnecting the second one, the part of you that keeps score. So no, weed doesn't make you focus. It makes you stop noticing that you didn't. And once you understand that, you realize the high isn't sharper attention at all. It's the most convincing impression of it your brain can produce. The real question isn't whether weed helps you focus. It's why feeling focused feels so much better than actually being focused. Drop your honest experience in the comments. I read them. And if this rewired how you think about your own brain, that's what the subscribe button is for.